Okay, and again, what we're going to do here, okay, the recording finally started. Okay, what we're going to do here is we are going to just look at chapter 6. We're going to look at the first 2 sections of chapter 6. We'll leave the third one. Is that right? 1, 2, 3. Yep. We'll leave the third one for next week, and we'll also leave the practical where I kind of go through and show you how to do it on your own. The practices there, we'll leave those for next week also. Okay, so go ahead and share screen, share the view there, what we've got. Okay. All right, so chapter 6 is all about how to control access to files. Because again, like I said before, you know, all the files on our system, they're going to have an owner, a user who's an owner. They're going to have a group owner, and then they're also going to have permissions for everybody else, for other. Okay, so what we want to look at is how how to control access to different files using both the group idea and along with the permissions. Okay, so let's just get right into it. So let's talk a little bit about what file permissions look like. Okay, so basically, let's say that you have a user, okay, like Joshua is, he's a member of both, he's this blue circle here, he's a member of both his own group and this other group called Web. Okay, while Allison might be a member of the group with her own name, as we would expect, and the group called Web and a group called Wheel. Okay, and so what we want is we want for there to be, let's say there could be some files that maybe Joshua himself owns, but we want people like Allison to be able to have access to them as well. So we would put those into a group. Maybe we might say Joshua can read and write to a file, and anybody that's a part of the group Web can as well. So it would be kind of like if, let's say, this class, for example, I want any student that's part of the CSE 313 group to be able to access the files that are associated with maybe the assignment. Let's say for the assignment, like assignment 1 that you guys just finished. Okay. And what we could do is we could maybe say anybody who's in the CSE 313 group can read the assignment file. You can't write to it. I don't want you to change the assignment. I just want you to be able to see what's in it. Okay. And then we might say, but Joseph, the user who's the owner of the file, the user owner of the file, he can read and write the file. Okay, so that might be something like what we could do. Yeah. So let's talk a little about what each of those means, okay? Because files and directories are different, and I'm gonna tell you, this was one of those things that last year when I taught this course, this was something that a lot of students weren't totally clear on, at least as far as the directories were concerned. Okay, the files pretty straightforward. Directories, I had a little bit of a hard time with them. So I want to go ahead and explain this for sure. Okay, so we have 3 types of permissions. We have read, write, and execute. Okay, so read means on files. The contents of the file can be read. This does not mean that you can see that there's a file with that name. Many times anybody can see that there's a file with that name. We'll talk about that on the directory side of things in just a moment. But let's say you know that that file is there. You can open it and you can see the what's inside of it. If it's a text file, if it's a PDF, you know, whatever, you are allowed to open it. You can see what's in it. Okay. Write means that you can change the contents of the file. You can put new text into a text file. By the way, just because you can write to a file does not mean that you can read from a file. Sometimes we can add text to a file that we cannot see what's in it. Okay. It's totally different. If you remember from your Java programming days, when we read from files, when we wrote to files, right? You opened a file for writing, you didn't have to open it for reading, right? You could write to a file and never know what was in it. Okay. All right. So execute means that we can execute the file. If it is a binary file, if it is an executable file, if we have execute permissions on it, we can run that file. Okay. Now, directories. This is where it gets a little tricky. Okay. Contents of the, if we think of that, if we can read a file, that means we can see what's inside of the file. If we can read a directory, it means we can see what's inside of the directory. Right? It means we can know what files are inside of that directory. Okay. In the same way. Now, it doesn't mean, let me go back for a second. Just because I can see what's inside of a directory doesn't mean that I can read the files in that directory. Okay. You might be able to know that there is an assignment 2 file in my assignments directory. You might be able to read the directory. Go to see that there's an assignment 2 there. It's not done yet. I haven't finished it, so I can't upload it just yet. I'm sorry. But you could see that it's there. But you can't read what's inside of the file till I give you permission to do that. Okay. All right. Right. So on a directory, writing to a directory over here, right, means that a file can be created or deleted from the directory. This is the one that got really confusing for a lot of students last year, okay? Because they were confused. You don't have to have read, write, or execute permission on a file in order to delete it if you have write permission on the directory that it's in. Okay? I'm going to say that again because I think that can be confusing to some people. If I have write permission on a directory, okay, I can delete a file in there even if I have no access rights to the file itself at all, which means I could just remove it. It could just go away. I could delete someone else's file even though I cannot see what's in it. Okay, if I have write permission on a directory. So write permission on a directory could be pretty powerful. Right? We can change what files are there. We can delete files that are there. No, we can't change files. We can delete files or create files in the directory with write permission. Okay. Effect on directories. Execute means the contents of the directory can be accessed. Okay, depends on the permissions of the files that are in the directory. Okay, so if we have access to the contents of the directory. Okay, and so we can get to them. All right, so that's very important. Read, write, execute. Make sure you are clear on that. All right. So what if we want to know what type of permissions we have on a file? Well, remember this ls-l? If we do this ls-l on a file or a folder, all right, then what's going to happen is we're going to see, if we do it on a file, we're going to see that file, we're going to see the owner, we're going to see the group owner, and we're going to see some other information like last date changed and stuff like that. Okay. If we want to see the directory, see the -d here option means just the directory. Okay, we don't want to see what's inside of the directory, we just want to see the directory itself. If we just do ls-l with the directory, we get the directory itself and anything inside of it as well. Okay, so here we see, by the way, it's in three groups of 3. Okay, so here, this is the user owner permissions. So the user owner has read, write, but not execute permission, which is pretty common to not have execute permission on a file because most files are not executable. Most files are just, you know, text files and stuff like that. Okay, so read, write, no execute for the student user. The second group of 3, read, write, not execute for the student group. So anybody who's in the student group can read and write to this file. And then the final one is for everybody else, for other. read, but no write and no execute. This is the standard. Anytime you create a file, this will be the default setup for a file. Read, write, not execute, read, write, not execute, read, not write, not execute. Okay, so that basically means that anybody that can log into the system can read the file, can see the contents, can't change them. Okay. Here we have a directory set up in its standard format. Okay, directory. The first character says that it's a D, it's a directory. The first character is a dash, says that it's a file. Okay. Read, write, execute for the user. Read but don't write, but execute for the group. Read but don't write, but execute for the for all others. Okay. Actually, I think the default makes this right or not. But we'll see that. We'll see that in practice in just a moment. Okay. All right. So let's look at a few examples here. Okay. So here we have some users and the groups they're a part of. So Lucy is part of the Lucy and the Ricardo groups. Ricky is part of the Ricky and the Ricardo groups. Ethel is part of the Ethel and the Mertz. Fred is part of the Fred and the Mertz. If you've ever seen that very old American TV show called I Love Lucy, this is characters from that show. Okay, so let's say we have the permissions set up like this, where you have an L file 1, L file 2, R file 1, R file 2. All right, so the user for both of these two files are the Lucy files. She's the owner of these files. All right, the Ricky files here are these R files. He's the owner of these files. Now Lucy is the group owner for this file 1. Ricardo is the group owner for all the other files, though. Okay, and let's make one more note here that this directory dir is owned by the user Ricky, and group owner is Ricardo. Okay, so let's take a look at what some of this stuff means. Okay, so Lucy is the only person who can change the contents of L file 1. Let's see, L file 1, right? Well, let's take a look. Okay, Lucy as the user can do this, yeah. Part of the group, anybody part of the Lucy group? Well, she's the only person that's part of the Lucy group, so yeah. And all others have no write access. So anybody who's a part of any other group or anybody who's not the Lucy user is not allowed to write to L file 1. Right, good. Okay. Okay. Ricky can view the contents of L file 2, but cannot modify the contents of L file 2. Now this is another one that gets people tripped up. Okay, gets people kind of like, what? The reason why is because look, Lucy is the owner. She can read and write to the file. Okay, but Ricky is not Lucy. Ricky is a different user. Okay, Ricardo is a group. Ricardo as a group can read only the file. Ricky is part of the Ricardo group, so these are the permissions he gets. Okay, and then finally you have the other, read, write, not execute, for everybody else. So this is the reason why this gets people confused, okay, is that they say, I don't understand, Hoja, I don't get it. How can other people who are not in the Ricardo group, how can they write to the file, but Ricky, who's part of the Ricardo group, how can people who are outside of our circle, outside of our group, how are they allowed to do something that people inside of our group are not? That doesn't make sense, okay? It does if you understand the way permissions are given, okay? Permissions are given by user first. If you are this user, if you are the user owner of this file, you get the user owner permissions, period. It doesn't even look to the other permissions. Those are the permissions you get. Okay. If you are not the user, if you are part of the group, you get those permissions. It doesn't look to the other. Okay. If you are not the user, that's the owner. If you are not in the group, that is the group owner, then you will be granted whatever permissions remain. Whatever permissions are the third set of permissions. Okay. So that's how a file like this can have less access for a person who's part of the group than access that is given to people who are outside of the group. Okay. It doesn't usually happen. This is a strange occurrence. This kind of thing normally would not occur, but it can. And if we set the permissions this way, we have to remember that in this situation, Ricky would be given this middle set of permissions, this read-only permissions, even though other people like Ethel and Fred might be able to both read and write to the file. Okay. Okay. Hold on just a second. I will be right back. Okay. So we're back again. All right, so let's take I don't want to spend too much time on all of these, but I did want to make sure to hit up this second one here because of how confusing it can be. Okay, let's talk about that Ricky can delete L file 1 and L file 2. The reason why he can delete any files inside of this down in here, right? And the reason he has write permissions on the directory. So Ricky has write permissions on the directory, which means that he can delete any files inside of the directory. Okay. Now Ethel can change the contents of L file 2. Again, this comes back to this whole Ricky cannot modify it because he was given this middle set of permissions. Ethel, however, was given this last set of permissions that included writing. So she can change the contents of L file 2. Okay. So even though she cannot change the contents of the directory, she can change what's in L file 2. Okay. Lucy can change the contents of R file 1. That's because she's also in the Ricardo group. Ricky can view and modify the contents of R file 2. He owns the file and has both read and write access. Lucy can view but not modify R file 2. That's this one right here. So Lucy, she's not Ricky, which means she doesn't get to have read and write access, but she is part of the Ricardo group, so she can have read-only access. Okay. And Ethel and Fred do not have any access to R file 2. Ethel and Fred, R file 2, their permissions are this. They get no access at all. Okay. All right, so that covers that. We will do, again, just like I said yesterday, just like I said earlier today for the other quiz in chapter 5, go ahead and try this and take a look and see if you can figure out how, this is another set, Wilma, Fred, Betty, and Barney. It's an old cartoon. That's an old American cartoon called The Flintstones, if you've ever seen it. Some characters from there. So I encourage you to look through this quiz and see if you can understand how this is, how all these permissions get put. Okay? All right. One more section and then we'll call it a day. So we've seen what permissions mean. Let's take a look at how permissions are granted. Okay. So we use the chmod command in order to change permissions. Okay. So we say chmod, what do we want to do with it, and what file or directory are we operating on? Okay. So we have this who, what, which format. Okay, so who are we trying to change stuff for? Is it the user? Is it the group? Is it other? or is it everyone? So do we want to give read permission to everyone? Do we want to give write permission to everyone? You know, what do we want to do? Okay. Plus, minus, or equal means we can be adding permission. So if we are adding a permission that someone already has, like for example, if we did add read for all, for example, A plus R. If somebody already has read permission, they just keep it. Nothing changes for them. Okay. Remove. We can remove a permission. We can say, I want to take away write permission from somebody. Or set exactly, which means that I want to make it this. So I want to only give write permission. I want to give only read permission, that kind of thing. Okay. All right. Let's see. Again, read, write, execute. We already talked about that, so I don't want to go through that. So UGOA, use U for user, which is the owner of the file. G for group, which is the group owner of the file. O for other, it's for anybody else outside of those two. And A for all three of them. Okay. There is another option for how to use the chmod command. We can do it using a numeric value. So, and it would be user, owner, group. Now it's kind of a set exactly kind of thing. Okay, so the way that we would do this is the sum R is 4, W is 2, X is 1. So if we did something like 777, it would be giving all permissions to everybody. Okay, if we did 666, that would be giving read and write permissions to everybody. Okay, if we did something like 640, then that would be giving read and write permission to the user owner. 4 would be read only permission to the group owners, to the group, and no permissions at all to everybody else. Okay, so you can do any number between 0 and 7, okay, which is the sum of 4, 2, and 1. Okay. So some examples here of how to do this on a file. So if we wanted to give the group and other, we want to take away the read and write permissions from file 1 for them. If we wanted to add execute permissions on file 2 to everybody, we could do it this way. Now here, let's take a look at this one. I want to change the sample directory to have this type of permission set up, 750. Now what is 7? 7 is 111, which would be read, write, and execute. So all three, read, write, and execute. And who does that go to? That goes to the user owner of the directory. Okay. 5 would be what? 4 plus 1. So read plus execute. So read, not write, but execute permissions are now given to the group owner of the sample directory. And then finally 0, no permissions. So all others will get no permissions at all. They can't read, they can't write, they can't do anything. Okay. All right. We could also use the -R option to recursively set permissions. So in a directory, we would give these permissions to everyone, all the files that are inside of it as well. Okay. All right. Now, one thing we might want to do is we might want to change the owner, the user owner, or the group owner of a file. Okay. So, because sometimes, like, remember, a file by default will have as its user owner the user who created it, and will have the group owner be the primary group that the user belongs to. Okay, which means that by default, really kind of the user who creates the file is the only one who has permissions to start with. So what we can do then is we can change the ownership of a file to someone else, to either another user so that they can have access to it, to another group so that other users that are a part of that group can have access to it, and so forth. So we do that using the chown command, the change ownership command. So we're going to change the ownership of the file, foo file, to be student. So the student will now be the owner of the foo file. We can also do the -r again to do it recursively for anything inside of this directory would now belong to the student user. If we want to change the ownership, the group ownership of a file, we can do that with the colon. Okay. So now instead of having just chown username file, now we're going to chown colon with a group name instead, and then the name of the directory or file that we want to change the ownership for. Okay. And we can finally do it for both at the same time. Change the user owner and the group owner of a file in one command. Okay, so we don't have to do this as two separate commands. Okay. All right. So now we'll have a guided exercise next week. That's the first two sections of this chapter 6 discussion I wanted to do. If there's no questions, then what we'll do is we will end the lecture here for today. Let me go ahead and stop sharing this. Okay. And I'm back. So what we'll do is we will end the recording there and end the lecture there unless there are any questions. And like I said, we will go through the practices from chapter 6 for next week. Okay. I encourage you to, in the time between now and then, go ahead and do the lab from chapter 5 so that you can make sure that you understand how users and groups work and how to create them and mess around with that. Okay, so go ahead and do that you can do that today. You should probably be able to have it done by 12:30, honestly. So go ahead and do that sometime between now and next week, and I'll see you then if there are no questions. All right. Thank you guys for attending. I'll see you next week.